Picture this, it's 1994 and you're a Nintendo fan. There's no form of social media, no Nintendo Direct format to go off, you're in the wild west of gaming, nothing has been established unlike how it is today. You go into a game store and see a game called Donkey Kong. What does your brain think of? What could this be? With no word of mouth to go off, you take the game home with you and play it for the first time. Now, before getting into Donkey Kong on Game Boy, there's something worth bringing up. It's no secret that the Game Boy was a pretty big deal back when it released. It allowed most people for the first time to take almost home console-like experiences anywhere on the go with them, provided that they had enough batteries and light to see the screen. Anyway, early on in the console's lifespan, ports of NES games would exist. It's simple, you had Tetris on the NES, you had it on the Game Boy, Dr. Mario on the NES, Dr. Mario on the Game Boy. There are plenty examples of both consoles getting dual releases. Heck, even later on, Nintendo will start what many thought was something new with the Switch's Wii U ports way back in the 90s with NES Deluxe remasters running on the Game Boy. So let's jump back into the shoes of the average consumer. In 1994, you have Donkey Kong on Game Boy. You insert the game and to no surprise it's the iconic 1981 arcade title that's been downscaled to fit onto an original Game Boy. I mean, why wouldn't you think this? The standard of arcade ports being on NES was well established at this point, not to mention the amount of NES games that also had Game Boy versions. Maybe this is some kind of arcade collection of the original Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. seeing as he's on the box art. But hold on a moment, what's with these physics? The jumping feels different and the obnoxious full damage of the arcade version isn't present here. You press on, going through the 4 iconic stages of the original. You manage to get through the 4th level and expect to be met with the same ending screen, only for something very unusual to happen. Hold on a moment, is this the map of New York? What are these new enemies? World 1? I thought Donkey Kong only had like 4 stages. That's right, it's at this specific moment where Donkey Kong on Game Boy, or as it's referred to by fans as Donkey Kong 94, has one of the best twists I've ever seen in a game. The original arcade release has 4 levels, well how about 97 additional stages, all new movement options and mechanics. This is by far not just a simple remake for handheld systems and is instead its very own game. This would be today's equivalent if they remade Mario Wonder and after you beat the game it just kept going for another 20 worlds. All this extra content isn't just for show either. Let's take a look at how Donkey Kong on Game Boy is an outstanding title that still holds up today with the greatest from both the Mario series and Donkey Kong games that are out there. Getting into the actual game itself, once you've gotten through the arcade levels with your Donkey Kong 94's tutorial stages, things really start to open up. Basically, each level is centered around this key mechanic where you have to find and escort this key to open the door in order to progress forward. Each world will have multiple boss fights against Donkey Kong himself. They can sometimes be like the original arcade release where you simply have to reach Pauline at the top. But other times they can be more action focused, having you literally throwing barrels back at the ape, giving him a taste of his own medicine. Let's talk about Mario himself for a moment and just how incredible his moveset is in this game. The amount of mobility options that you have in Donkey Kong 94 easily outnumbers even some of the 3D Mario games. One move he only has in this title and has never appeared since is this handstand maneuver. It looks strange at first and honestly I wasn't too sure on how to use it outside of gaining momentum, but this is such a cool concept for a move. Basically, the handstand is a defensive option. Mario is known for receiving damage whenever his head is hit by an enemy, with his legs jumping on enemies being known as his iconic way of dealing damage in the 2D games. But the handstand option allows him to take damage on his upper half without dying because obstacles like barrels don't harm him in this position. It's a cool concept for a move that flips the script in a literal way and one that I think the 3D games should take inspiration from. Speaking of 3D Mario, one of the most well-known facts about this game is how the iconic backflip that most people associate with the 1996 classic Mario 64 was actually first introduced here. What surprised me a lot about playing Donkey Kong 94 for the first time is just how this Game Boy game has momentum and actual physics. Bear in mind the Game Boy only has 2 face buttons and a D-pad outside of pause and select. But somehow, these developers managed to craft this really natural feeling movement system that far surpasses even Mario World on Super Nintendo in terms of how many maneuvers that you can perform. Looking back on the level structure, each time you beat Donkey Kong these small animations play out. I kind of miss these. A lot of games back in the day had them after beating a boss or world, which usually demonstrated the next level gimmick that the world would be based on. Speaking of, there is so much personality in the animations for this game. The novelty of it all being on a system with such limited capabilities is very charming. Anyway, these animations will demonstrate a new gimmick that the world is centered on. For instance, you have these clotheslines that you can spin on to gain momentum. There are also these springs and blocks that activate a time limit where you can choose where to place a platform. Each world and even individual levels are centered around some kind of gimmick, and part of it being a great puzzle platformer is figuring it out. I will say though, the difficulty definitely kicks in during World 6 with the aeroplane levels. The central gimmick here is how you're in the sky, so you have to deal with the wind constantly pushing you back. When combined with the boss fights, things start to get very tricky. World 7 continues this trend of having terrain hinder your progress by introducing ice physics, which is the bane of many gamers out there. Sometimes, due to the limited hardware, things would be a little difficult to make out. I especially had issues telling whether or not a ladder was climbable at times. Anyway, before moving on to the grand finale of Donkey Kong 94, I would first like to talk about the enemies for this game. A lot of them would only ever appear in this title, and they have some very unique designs. Also, Donkey Kong Jr. teams up alongside the Big Ape at times to stop you. In some sections, you even have to climb vines like in the arcade Donkey Kong Jr. title. Anyway, once again, another staple that this game first introduced is the mini mushroom. It doesn't act how it does today in Donkey Kong 94, it's pretty much a power down item that DK Jr. throws at you. But it is interesting seeing its origins in this title. It pretty much shrinks you down, making you move slower and makes it impossible to perform high jumps alongside certain maneuvers. There are quite a few small details in this game that are worth bringing up. Even the cover art itself is pretty interesting. This is since it was the first modern appearance of Pauline that we still see in games today. I was surprised to find out that it dates all the way back to 1994. It's also the first time that we see Mario appear on these covers or art for this series, since he used to be known as Jumpman and had this pretty dated design in the original arcade release. Anyway, obvious trivia aside, I feel like this design of Donkey Kong is what the new Bonanza game look of the character is based off. In my opinion, the big difference between Nintendo and Rare's design for this character is how Rare designed DK to reflect the 90s and look cool, whereas Nintendo wanted him to be more of a bumbling ape-like character with him being more expressive. Speaking of, this game actually released the same year as Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo. In that game's opening, they made fun of the original arcade title by having the new DK jump in and start dancing, showing how those games were for old people. This character was going through a major bit of rebranding at the time with his appearance, and even straight up having a genre shift, going from a puzzle platformer into a more traditional 2D side-scroller. I feel like with the popularity of the country games taking over, the arcade title still stayed fairly well known in pop culture. But Donkey Kong 94 seems to have gone off the radar in terms of people even hearing about this entry when talking about the series today. One possible reason behind this fact is that it released on a handheld instead of following its arcade roots due to the fact that console gaming was starting to take over the arcade scene as we know it at the time. On top of that fact is that outside the series that began on handhelds like Wario Land and Pokemon, most handheld installments of console games tend to not get brought up as much in general discussion. For instance, you typically hear way more conversation and debates on Mario 3 and World compared to Land 1 and 2 for example. I'm not saying that Donkey Kong 94 is some secret hidden gem or anything, but consider this. The country games made by Rareware completely rebranded that character and their image. On top of that fact, the arcade series that are a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong 94 will change their name to Mario vs Donkey Kong moving forward. I know that in this video I mentioned how this game is aligned with how it sold itself as just the arcade game, with it being so much more beneath its arcade roots. But in all honesty, just taking a look at promotional trailers for this title, or even just looking at the back of the box art for this game, it clearly showed more levels than just the arcade original release. So there's definitely an argument to be made that back in 1994 consumers already knew that this wasn't just a simple port of an NES game like Tetris or Dr. Mario was. But consider this game today with how it's no longer acknowledged by the mainstream gaming sphere. Most people who see this title today just assume it's the arcade original and not its own wholly unique game. The title of this game is definitely its most apparent issue when looking at it today. It's just called Donkey Kong. Unless you make the distinction, people are going to assume that you mean the arcade version. It's such a bizarre naming decision. They literally should have named it anything else like Donkey Kong DX The Lost Levels or something to just make it stand out more and give it more distinction. It'd be like if Nintendo made a new 2D Mario game on the Switch 2 and just called it Mario Wonder. It's such a polished and well crafted game. Whether or not it was intended to be a sequel or a remake or something else is a discussion that gamers are still debating on nowadays with just how different remakes can be compared to their original releases. It's crazy how this discussion dates all the way back to the 90s on the original Game Boy of all systems. Even if you're not a fan of these games, you have to admit that as a sequel or successor to the arcade games, this is an incredible leap in terms of gameplay, quality, and overall scope with its amount of content. Sorry for the long rant, I just wanted to discuss this aspect of DK94 since it's become a part of the game's legacy when looking at the title today. Anyway, one last point I'd like to bring up before looking at the finale for Donkey Kong 94 is just how impressive this title is for a Game Boy release. A lot of entries that released later on in the system's lifespan were very impressive given the technical limitations of the machine. You had games like Pokemon Gen 2 which had day and night cycles, or probably the best example being the original Shantae release. This title just looks incredible for a Game Boy game, everything is animated so fluently. Whilst Donkey Kong 94 might not look as impressive visually as these other titles, where it truly stood out to me is with its physics. It's just crazy how you can build momentum and perform all these maneuvers on a system like this. But this title is very fluent and responsive. I actually prefer Mario's moveset here than in any of the other 2D games. This is since there are just so many movement options on offer here and they're all useful in their own way. Okay, this might seem a little silly, but it's just a formality. We are now reaching endgame content. If you would like to avoid spoilers, then please skip to this timestamp on screen. After overcoming all the obstacles that this game has thrown at us up until this point, we now enter the final world and it's a mad dash to chase Donkey Kong up this tower. The game is very reflex heavy at this point, relying more on timing than anything else. Junior won't stop throwing poisonous mushrooms at you from above, but you eventually catch up to them and lock up that abomination for good.
Out! School prison!
All that's left now is taking down DK himself. After navigating up this much harder level from the arcade original, we finally cornered the ape at the top of the tower. After all this time, it's now one last final boss fight. The music is going absolutely crazy at this point as you have to rely on your handstand to catch his barrels. The constant back and forth as you navigate between playing offensive layer and defensive layer is a great dynamic. Things are looking good after you finally take him out, but all of a sudden the music stops. Now, any self-respecting review of this game wouldn't be complete without mentioning how the floating hands boss gimmick is a recurring boss in a lot of older Nintendo games from back in the day. Personally, it's a gimmick that's never really bothered me and makes sense from a technical limitation point of view. Kind of reminds me of the story behind Rayman's design. Anyway, this boss is hard, it goes on for a good while and you're constantly avoiding what's falling in from above you whilst also avoiding the shockwaves from Donkey Kong's fists. After some careful maneuvers and throwing barrels down on Donkey Kong, we finally win and are rewarded with a cutscene. Why does this ending give me 90s sitcom vibes? Anyway, and that's Donkey Kong 94, a very ambitious game that's kind of fallen under the radar in the modern day. I definitely recommend booting up this title today. For me, it's up there with Mario 3 and World when it comes to the very best of Nintendo's classic platformers. It's been kind of interesting for me making this video since during this time the announcement of a new Donkey Kong game with Bonanza got revealed. And I've got to say, it's kind of amazing how much these two IPs have changed and evolved so much over time. Hopefully, this video has shed some light on this somewhat forgotten classic in the modern day and how it ingeniously plays around and subverts audiences' expectations. Have you ever played this title before, and what do you think of this series? Let me know in the comments section. Also, any feedback on this video will be appreciated. Thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a nice rest of your day.